When the heir came into her room, he immediately began to look around with great interest. Hestia didn't like this interest at all, but there was absolutely nothing she could do about it, since she had already received a guest on the estate's territory. Meanwhile, the girl continued to think to herself that her room was not a museum at all, so that one could look so closely. Heli himself personally stated in a reply letter his desire to come to the estate as Hyperion, and the lady could not object to him. And since the guy showed up not as the crown prince, but as an ordinary guest, the miss had to receive him in her room. Only now Hestia was incredibly angry at the guy who was studying everything with such undisguised interest. Unexpectedly, Helios asked if the Marquise was really responsible for her husband's internal affairs, and the lady nodded affirmatively in response. The prince then asked permission to look at the documents Hessie was filling out, and she found no reason to refuse. And the guy quickly discovered that the lady had an unusual way of doing things, which usually surprised him. Heli himself did not expect that the more he learned about Miss, the more fascinating talents he would be able to find in her. The heroine herself at that moment did not even suspect the guest's thoughts, so she stood quietly waiting for him to be ready to speak. A couple of dozen minutes later, the prince, as expected, began to convince the Marquise to work for him, stating that it would be for the good of the empire. From surprise and fear before such a speech, Hestia almost spilled the tea that she was carefully pouring into mugs. It turned out that the heir was greatly inspired by the prophecy that helped at the border and decided to find out everything at once. The Marquise did not immediately think of what to say in response to the impudent and self-confident guy, so as to very discreetly refuse in the end. As a result, the lady referred to her husband's health, and the prince noticed that the girl did not even begin to doubt for a second. But he couldn't just leave Hestia alone, so he began to insist that household chores weren't that important. Finally, Helios could not stand it any longer and asked why the Marquise had given information about the border if she did not want to help. In response, Hessie cleverly explained with a smile on her face that she simply wanted to get information about the Saints' tea party and nothing more. Then Heli reminded him that he was a prince, but even to this, the lady stated that she had an appointment with Mr. Hyperion today. In response to all this, the heir could not stand it and declared that using such powers only for himself was too selfish. Although Hestia was incredibly angry at these words, she was still able to calmly say that she was simply putting her husband first. Helios felt the most hurt when Miss suddenly remembered that he was enjoying happiness with Diana and left Kael alone. After this, the guy realized that he couldn't win over this smart girl verbally, and he had to come up with something else. He thoughtfully drank the tea, when suddenly he began to cough sharply and spat out everything he had managed to taste. Although Hessie tried to find out what was going on, the prince continued to cough and did not explain anything to her due to his condition. Imagine the lady's surprise when the heir, finally coming to his senses, declared that his wife was brewing exactly the same tea. Now the heroine felt offended, because she knew perfectly well that the princess did not know how to brew tea at all. Not believing what was happening, Hestia furiously raised the cup to her mouth, wanting to personally taste the tea and make sure that it was delicious. But the drink really turned out to be disgusting, which greatly surprised the miss, but she accepted the opinion of the crown prince. Suddenly, Helios could not resist asking what the Marquise wanted, which immediately brought a sly smile to her sweet face. The Marquise politely asked to return her husband's title, which immediately angered the prince, because it was very difficult to do. But the girl had no intention of changing her decision, as she sincerely wanted her guest to suffer a little in the end. With this demand, the lady completely opposed herself to the princess, as was once the case with the villain Ratona. Moreover, the return of the title would clear the Marquis' name, but it was unclear whether his former friend would dare to take such a difficult step. As a result, Heli admitted, somewhat upset, that the final decision would still be his father's, but he would try. Then the heroine once again put pressure on the guy, declaring that these were her rules, and she agreed to exchange her abilities for them. The heir said nothing in response, because he understood that he was in an extremely difficult situation, but he needed foresight. While the prince sat with his head down sadly, the lady happily thought that this would not last long, but would still calm him down. Having decided to help the guy a little, Miss suddenly offered him a plan of action for which she needed written confirmation. However, Helios was in no hurry to rejoice at such an indulgence, because it was very difficult to find a reason to return the title. However, after thinking about it, the heir decided that it would be more profitable than nothing at all, so he agreed to the Marquise's plan. The heroine was extremely happy that she was able to get such a good deal for herself, so she smiled sincerely. When the lady watched Hyperion leave a few minutes later, She couldn't believe that he needed her abilities so much. In fact, Hestia felt even more comfortable when the guy looked down on her, believing that everything was completely under his control. The girl was going to take advantage of this at all costs and raise Kaelus to the very heavens, because she loved him very much. A few days later, Hessie got ready and went to her friend's place, because she had received a letter about the tea party day. Countess Erinys immediately greeted the lady with a smile, as she was glad to see someone so interesting. However, Madame did not miss the opportunity to shame the Marquis's wife for the fact that for some reason she did not immediately tell her about everything. Although the lady really felt awkward, she was not going to back down from her chosen goal because she wanted to ally with Madame. The heroine knew in advance that a personal dialogue would make a greater impression, although it would take place a little later in time. As a result, the Countess really did turn out to be well disposed towards Hestia, despite her recent reproaches. The aristocrat carefully made sure that the girls had a little something to eat while they discussed the latest news. Suddenly, Hestia started talking about having tea for everyone at once, which immediately surprised Erinys, since it rarely happened. The Countess thoughtfully lowered her head and said that it would clearly be difficult for the princess to prepare everything on her own. After which the woman said with alarm that Diana would probably ask Teacher Harmonia for help once again. The heroine immediately noticed how much Erinys was worried about this, although she pretended that everything was fine. She didn't like the fact that there was another madam, from whom almost everyone always asked for help, bypassing the Countess. The lady was now sure that, although the woman had maintained a neutral attitude throughout, she would have liked to be called. As a result, the Marquise decided that it would be a good idea to take advantage of all the information she knew. So the girl turned on the actress and pretended that she was very sorry that many people didn't even notice Erinys because of mistrust. The lady said that she didn't understand why Harmonia was helping her at such an important event, since she was just a teacher. After which the miss added that the saint made such a choice only because she did not know how wise and experienced the Countess was. Imagine the heroine's surprise when the woman suddenly grinned terribly and asked if she really thought so. Hessie sincerely thought that Erinys would enjoy these discussions and that she was going in the right direction, but apparently she was wrong. Suddenly, the Countess smiled sweetly and said that she also thought the same and was sad that almost everyone underestimated her. Then the lady reminded that it would be difficult for all the nobles to earn the prince's trust because of the flood, and Erinys knew about it. The lady jumped up in displeasure and declared that the emperor should always have taken care of the citizens and that the aristocrats would have interfered. The fact is that at the time of the flood, the residents turned to the emperor for help, but he was too busy with his own affairs. Since other people had no right to interfere in territories that were not theirs, Diana managed to summon Helios and Kaelus. It was during this period that the love between the saint and the future heir only grew stronger, because they spent a lot of time together. The heroine knew all too well that the Marquis filled out all the documents for the prince while he walked with his beloved all day long. In the end, Hestia tried to calm down and confirmed that the emperor was very unhappy with the behavior of the nobles that year. But the girl was quite capable of creating a crack in the walls of the imperial palace if the Countess agreed to help. These words surprised the noble lady so much that she even wondered how realistic it was to organize something like this. Noticing the interest in Erinys' eyes, Hestia said that during tea, she would create a situation in which she would put Diana in a difficult position. The Countess guessed that at this moment, she would have to intervene and help the princess in order to win her trust. Since the prince's wife was a very simple person, she must quickly have begun to trust the aristocrat who helped her. The lady was sure that it would all work. She just didn't know whether the Countess would ultimately cooperate with her. When Erinys asked what Hestia wanted in return, the miss asked her to become her companion in the world of aristocrats. This request surprised the Countess quite a lot, because she did not quite understand why the young Marquise needed all this. However, they formed an alliance, which the heroine still could not be happy about, even though she returned to the estate. The girl could only hope that Erinys would keep his promise, and that many noble ladies would eventually switch to her side. Lost in thought, Miss noticed too late a letter lying on the bed, which was an imperial pass. It also came with an entrance brooch, which surprised the lady, as she didn't think the prince needed her power so much. Hestia really was going to make some predictions, since she had promised, and at the same time, she wanted to find out about the saint's tea party. Suddenly, the heroine discovered that in the coming days, an event would take place that would be beneficial to her, and she decided to take advantage of it. However, the Marquise decided to go to the palace tomorrow, after telling her husband about her great plans. Almost falling asleep, Hessie, with a smile on her face, dreamed that tomorrow would be as good a day as today. But as a result, The heroine had to sweat because of nerves, since she did not expect that this situation would happen. For some reason, Kaelus himself went with the miss in the carriage to the imperial palace, although she did not invite him. Literally, the day before all this, the miss announced that she was going to the palace, which noticeably surprised the Marquis. The heroine herself was already pleased that she had reported to Kaelus, and therefore could set off on her journey with a clear conscience. But before that, the girl wanted to at least watch a little bit the actions of her talented husband, who was carving the figures. Suddenly, Kael reminded, somewhat wearily, that he had once already asked Miss not to report to him every time. However, the heroine stated that she would like to tell something to the Marquis first, and only then talk about it with the heir. Suddenly, the guy asked what the miss would do if he didn't want to listen, and Hestia hadn't foreseen such a turn of events. As a result, the Marquise lowered her head guiltily and said that she would not say anything to her beloved if he did not want to hear. In response, Kaelus suddenly leaned close to his wife and said that it would be enough for him if she would still call him by name. This request once again confused the heroine, because the lady still could not get used to this, no matter how hard she tried. While Kael looked very persistently into Miss's eyes, because he still wanted to hear his name from her lips. As a result, due to severe embarrassment, Hestia even began to stutter and could barely pronounce her husband's name, and only by syllables. Therefore, the Marquise even had to hide her face in her hands out of shame, but the young gentleman himself remained pleased. After that, the guy returned to work as if nothing had happened, while the lady continued to shyly dart around behind him. He methodically raised the pruning shears over the branches and cut off the excess, thereby creating a beautiful figure that was understandable to everyone. Suddenly, Kael heard that the emperor would soon fall and accidentally cut off the wrong branch. Hessie knew that his majesty had been in good condition all this time, but suddenly he lost consciousness and fell. Because of this, Diana began to spend her healing powers day and night in order to finally help the ruler. And it was at that moment that the princess's ability to heal someone worked for the very last time, after which it disappeared. The heroine did not know for sure whether she would return to the holy power many years after that incident, because the novel did not say anything about it. Suddenly, the Marquis asked if the lady could save the emperor, knowing about such a terrible future for him. But Miss replied that she could not guarantee anything, and this greatly saddened Kael, although he did not ask anything else. The boy lost his parents quite early, so he and his friend Helios were raised by his majesty. Hessie had read about it, so she could perfectly understand what feelings her husband was experiencing now, because he could not help in any way. The girl thought it would be better if she didn't touch Kaelus now, since he needed to deal with his emotions personally. So, although it was hard for her, the lady continued to stand silently, and only her tightly clenched hands revealed her condition. Completely unexpectedly for the Marquise, Kael suddenly announced that he was going to the palace with her, and she did not even have time to refuse. Thus, the boy and the girl found themselves in the same carriage, although the heroine had imagined this day completely differently. Although the young gentleman himself was very calm, the lady herself could not stop thinking about why he had come with her in the first place. As a result, Hestia gave in to her emotions so much that she even stopped watching her manners and slightly scared the guy. Suddenly, Kaelus broke the silence and quietly asked if the Marquis was afraid that his feelings for Diana might flare up again. The heroine wanted to say that she was worried about something else, but Kael suddenly interrupted her and said that she didn't have to worry at all. The miss was surprised when she heard that the Marquis was going to visit the emperor and did not wish to see the saint himself. However, the lady did not want the guy to force himself to do something, which she told him, although she herself was sad about it. Kaelus did not expect that his wife would suddenly support any of his emotions, even if they would ultimately only harm her, and Hestia said with a smile that in 2 years they would have to separate because she would no longer have abilities, but she was still happy. The Marquise understood that she could somehow influence her husband, but she did not intend to manipulate his feelings even a little. The gentleman silently listened to everything the girl told him, and for some time after that he continued to sit thoughtfully. Then suddenly he declared that each of them would return back separately, and this surprised Hestia, who did not expect such a thing. The lady tried to object, but Kael confidently stated that he was not a child at all, so he could easily take care of himself. Moreover, the Marquis suddenly took a stand and somewhat offendedly declared that he knew how to deal with problems on his own. Because of this nervous argument, Hestia went to Helios in a very bad mood and could not calm down, although she tried. But then the heroine remembered that this behavior was very similar to Kael from the original novel and smiled. So she wasn't even against the fact that the Marquis was behaving this way, when suddenly she heard the quiet conversations of the palace maids around her. Hessie hadn't originally intended to eavesdrop, but she noticed that the girls were talking about tea, and the topic concerned her as well. Although the assistants changed the subject almost immediately, the miss managed to understand that they were talking about some big tea party in the palace. And the only event that suited these words was the princess's next celebration, which she personally prepared. Since the marquise became very curious, she decided to secretly follow the maids and find out more information. And it turned out that the lady did it for a reason, because she accidentally heard that quarrels were happening in the palace every day. The heroine knew that Madame Marup, who was an extremely skilled maid of honor to the deceased empress, had worked here for a very long time. But the girl didn't expect that Diana would suddenly decide to argue with this important and respected woman for some reason. But personally, Hestia was only pleased with this plot twist, because it presented the princess in a very bad light for everyone around her. So the girl went to Helios in a good mood, but he greeted her so gloomily that the miss immediately became angry. Because of the undeserved grumbling, the marquise even changed her mind about politely greeting the guy, although she had previously planned to observe etiquette. However, the lady understood that she could not simply turn around and leave, because she had already arrived in the heir's office. Right now, the prince looked uselessly handsome, but the lady knew that soon she would have to greatly upset him with information about his father. Here Helios asked if it was normal to look at the face of someone else's husband like that, when Hestia herself was married to a marquis, after which the guy grinned slyly and specifically asked if Miss really liked handsome men that much. In order to at least slightly cope with her own negative emotions, the girl loudly slammed her hand on the table. This action greatly frightened Heli, who had no idea that he would accidentally anger his clairvoyant guest so much. As a result, Hestia completely stopped empathizing with the prince and stated point blank that his father would soon unexpectedly fall. Heli didn't believe it at all and jumped up emotionally, declaring that everything was fine with his father during a recent examination. The heir did not at all want to acknowledge the fact that the scene that the marquis saw in the future was bound to happen. He asked if there was a way to save the emperor, and the girl advised him to always keep someone close to his majesty. However, the lady reluctantly warned that even all these precautions might ultimately be of no help to the ruler. Then Helios gave vent to his emotions and very sadly asked why he needed the princess at all if she could not save her father. The heroine decided to keep quiet, and therefore gave the guy a little time so that he could come to his senses and not accidentally get angry at her. For Hessie, all the events that she predicted, knowing the plot of the novel, were really supposed to happen very soon. The miss knew that the saint had tried every night to cure the emperor without success when he suddenly became so ill. However, his majesty died, which made the marquise understand that even healing powers were not omnipotent. Unexpectedly, Helios with one movement summoned the nearest butler, Xenon, who immediately appeared in the office, after which the boy excitedly demanded that the assistant go to the emperor and promised to join soon. But Hestia immediately objected to the heir's actions, since he began to give orders too abruptly. Helios did not understand why the clairvoyant suddenly stopped him, although before that she herself had given advice to send someone to his father. Then the miss explained that now Kaelus was in audience with the emperor, and she would like Diana not to accidentally see him. Suddenly, Zeno intervened in the conversation and said that the princess had gone to have tea with the ruler a few minutes ago. This immediately horrified the boy and girl, because the situation was getting worse for them. Since Hestia and Helios knew exactly what kind of tea Diana had, they ran to the girl as quickly as possible. At that moment, the heroine was very worried about the fact that the saint ended up almost in the same place as Kaelus. But the prince was thinking about something of his own, and suddenly, on the run, asked permission to ask a question, and the lady agreed to listen to him. Then the guy asked in all seriousness whether poisoning could have accidentally caused the emperor's fall. But Miss had no proof of this, so Hestia suggested simply running even faster to make sure they made it in time. Diana herself had already managed to prepare tea and was glad that she would finally have tea with her relative. Suddenly, right in front of her, the princess completely unexpectedly saw the marquis, whom she had once driven away. This made the girl freeze in amazement, because she didn't even think that Kaelus would come to the palace. Unable to bear it, the princess called her former friend by name, and the guy immediately turned sharply to her as he recognized the voice. The young gentleman tried his best to avoid meeting the one he was in love with, but he failed, and he froze in front of the saint. But what surprised the guy most was that his wife, whom he had previously told not to come to him under any circumstances, suddenly appeared nearby. However, the lady did not listen at all, and even came running in such a bad condition that for some time she could not speak. The heroine did not know whether her husband had managed to meet Diana and talk to her, so she was very worried and could not come to her senses. Behind the marquise was the prince, who was also catching his breath, but suddenly called his former friend by name. Since Kaelus had no desire to talk to the heir, he grabbed his wife by the hand and pulled her away. This action greatly upset Helios, but he did not pursue the marquis, deciding to respect his wish to avoid their conversation. Therefore, at the moment, the heroes have diverged greatly, since each has followed the path they personally chose. Hestia was incredibly pleased with everything because her husband suddenly took her hand for the first time and led her somewhere. Only after a few minutes of such a silent walk did Miss wonder why the guy had grabbed her and was still holding her. Suddenly, the lady heard conversations behind her, and someone called the princess's name, and she immediately realized that Diana was somewhere nearby. Although she was very afraid inside, the heroine still turned back to check her guest personally. And indeed, the saint was talking completely innocently with the servant, being very close to the marquis. Hestia couldn't even imagine what Kaelus must have felt now, having accidentally encountered the source of his suffering. The lady guessed that the guy was trying his best to contain his emotions, and that was why he was walking forward so quickly, holding her hand. When they had gotten a good distance away, Hestia smiled and tried to encourage her husband that he had done well. But the marquis remained just as indifferent and seemed not to understand why the girl was praising him for anything now. Suddenly, Kaelus flared up and shouted that Hestia had no right to judge, because she knew absolutely nothing about the real him. These words shocked the heroine so much that she couldn't even say a word in her defense. Hessie tried to explain that she had no intention of offending her husband in any way, but he did not listen to her at all. For the first time in the long time that she had been in the novel, the heroine suddenly felt a sharp pain somewhere deep inside herself. Therefore, the girl fell silent, and after some time, with great regret, asked the marquis for forgiveness. Only after this did Kaelus calm down more or less, and ordered his assistant to take them back to the estate as quickly as possible. That same evening, Hestia stood on the balcony with a glass of wine, wanting to relieve the tension that had built up throughout the day. The lady sincerely did not understand whether it was worth it to prevent the marquis from going with her to the palace, so that he would not be so angry in the end. However, the heroine could not foresee absolutely everything, which is why Kael accidentally saw the princess today. Holding a glass in her hands, the marquise thought in confusion about the fact that her husband had not said a word when they returned. Hestia found herself wanting to make sure the boy was okay, but she was afraid she would only end up making things worse. Therefore, the lady concluded that she would not try to get closer to Kael, whose heart was so far away, any more that evening. But then, completely unexpectedly for herself, the lady saw out of the corner of her eye how the guy with a very sad look came out onto the balcony. Suddenly the thought came to the heroine's head that the gentleman could once again try to kill himself because of a meeting with his beloved. The girl did not want to lose her lover at all, so she ran as fast as she could to his room, despite the late hour. Having reached her goal, she abruptly threw open the front doors and screamed at Kael not to make a mistake and kill himself. Imagine the surprise of the miss when she found in front of her a confused butler who did not understand what was happening. Hestia froze in place in amazement, unable to think of any excuse for her loud behavior a few seconds ago. It turned out that Kaelus had simply gone out onto the terrace to get some fresh air, and at that very moment he returned to the room. The boy asked Uros to leave them alone, and the assistant immediately carried out the order, despite the protests and pleas of the marquise. As a result, the lady felt as if she was completely alone, although her husband was standing expectantly in the room behind her. Imagine Hestia's surprise when the guy suddenly came up to her from behind, lightly touching her body with his clothes, after which he quietly whispered that he had an important conversation with his wife, which shocked the girl even more. Even Kaelus himself seemed genuinely confused and unsure of what he was doing for the first time, although he did not back down. Gently embracing the marquise, the gentleman suddenly asked her forgiveness for what had happened between them that afternoon. In response, the heroine immediately turned away due to the embarrassment that flared up and said that everything was completely fine with her. After which, still without turning her head, the girl asked her husband how he was feeling at that moment. To this, Kael responded in a completely relaxed manner that he had managed to sleep a little, so he felt much better than he had in the morning. Unexpectedly, the marquis suddenly asked why the lady did not look him in the eye, and the girl did not immediately think of what to answer to this. Then the gentleman finally left the miss alone and walked away a short distance so that Hestia could finally come to her senses and relax. The heroine did not expect that the marquis would suddenly report that he had seen her on the balcony, because she was drinking wine there quite freely. Moreover, while thinking, the girl behaved extremely ugly, since she did not know that someone was watching her. Suddenly, Kaelus called out to his wife again, and showing her a bottle of wine, invited the Marquise to drink a glass with him. Hestia would never have allowed herself to refuse such an offer, because she immediately felt as if she were in a dream. The lady would never have thought that the day would come when she would drink so freely in her lover's room. Since the lady didn't know when she would have such a chance again, she decided to watch the guy's face as much as possible. The image of the half-dressed Marquis was so beautiful right now that Hestia couldn't take her eyes off him even for a second. As a result, due to an excess of feelings, the girl even hit her head on the table just to get herself in order. Kaelus watched his wife's tossing and turning with surprise, and could not understand whether it was because she had drunk too much. And the lady herself could not help but think about how wonderful her husband was, so that her heart sank even more with love. Suddenly, the Marquis approached the girl and asked why she had suddenly blushed so much. The guy was sincerely worried that the lady might accidentally faint, but in the end, his proximity only made things worse. Therefore, Hestia involuntarily blushed even more, although at that moment she herself was in seventh heaven with happiness. In order to somehow break this atmosphere, the Marquise loudly asked what the princess's reaction was when they met. Because of this, Kaelus's romantic face immediately darkened, and the girl realized that she had gone too far. However, the Marquis did not scold his wife for such a delicate question, but instead sat down next to her. It was only after a few seconds that Kael was able to admit that he noticed how surprised Diana was to see him in the palace. But the saint quickly regained her composure and began to treat her friend as before. The princess even reproached him for the fact that for some reason he came to visit, without even warning her about it with a single word. Unlike the girl, the Marquis at that moment could not speak as freely and calmly, because he still felt pain, and Diana suddenly quite easily suggested that they all drink tea together if their former friend came to meet the emperor. The prince's wife chatted so quickly that Kaelus did not even have the opportunity to say a word to her, and only now did the guy realize that at that moment he was drawn to the saint, although he tried to make sure that this did not happen. Unable to bear it, the Marquis suddenly asked Hestia why she was so sure that he would be able to forget his feelings for the saint. The guy admitted that he was so worried during the entire meeting that he couldn't even talk normally with the emperor. Hestia couldn't even imagine that her husband was actually so worried about everything that was happening to his girlfriend. Looking at his hands, Kaelus wondered what he had done wrong if Diana was able to speak to him as usual. The lady realized that all she could do for the Marquis was to listen to him, so she continued to sit in silence. And Kael himself suddenly asked sadly, to no one in particular, why he had wasted his life on such useless attempts. The heroine's eyes widened as she finally realized the depth of the boy's suffering, which he had kept silent about. In the original story of the novel, the Marquis was the happiest man in the world, but only while he loved Diana. So the girl wanted to support the guy and, grabbing his hand, shouted that all his deeds were not useless at all. Hestia guessed that the Marquis was trying to keep in his heart not the saint, but his feelings for her that he had. All because Kael was a man who truly knew how to love, and the Marquise told him about it. She held her husband's hand tightly, so that he could feel her warmth and, at least a little, distract himself from his heavy thoughts. Kaelus did not expect that the girl would suddenly tell him that she was looking forward to his good and calm future. The gentleman immediately became interested, and therefore asked if Hestia had seen what would happen to him later. In response, the heroine explained that she could not see what she wanted, but she would try to do everything to make Kael happy. Suddenly, the lady realized that she had been holding her husband's hand for quite a long time. This made Miss jump up immediately and sheepishly announce that it was already late, so she would go to bed. But before Hestia could take even a step away, the Marquis suddenly grabbed her hand with an anxious expression on his face. This surprised the girl very much, because they had already finished the dialogue, so she looked questioningly into her husband's eyes. However, in the end, the gentleman changed his mind and lowered his head, saying that the Marquise could go to her room. Hestia guessed that the guy was about to say something, but decided to give him time to finally calm down. But the girl didn't even suspect that she would end up not being able to even catch a glimpse of her lover for several more days. All because she chose so much work for herself that she returned to bed only late at night and immediately fell asleep. Hestia was dealing with too many things at once, so she didn't even have time for herself. The heroine acted this way because she desperately wanted to be prepared for any unforeseen circumstances. Suddenly, when she was almost asleep, the lady jumped up in bed because she remembered something. Miss clenched her teeth tightly, as she only now realized what exactly was important that she had successfully forgotten. As a result, the girl wrote a letter to Madame, and literally the next morning the woman came to her estate. Harmonia admitted that she was surprised when she received a message from Hestia that she had urgent business. The heroine herself was a little ashamed to admit that she hadn't thought at all about what to wear to the tea party. It so happened that almost all the tailors were already busy, so the girl's only hope was in her teacher. The Marchioness understood perfectly well that at the celebration she had to be no worse than the princess herself. But Hessie didn't have time to sew a new dress, so she decided to remake one of the old ones. The lady knew that according to etiquette, it was undesirable to do such a thing, but in this situation, she saw no other way out for herself. The girl said that she already knows what people say about her in society, so she has nothing to be embarrassed about. However, the Marquise still hoped that if she showed herself in all her beauty, the opinion of the aristocrats could change. Harmony was pleased to hear such reasonable speeches from a lady who had managed to grow noticeably. So the lady tenderly hugged the girl, who was actually manipulating her very successfully at that moment. In order to get down to business quickly, the lady asked about the tailor, when suddenly the atmosphere in the room changed noticeably for the worse. The thing is that the tailor that Madame was able to find was named Decamar and belonged to the common people. But what scared Miss most was not even the guy's origin, but how huge he was compared to everyone else. Harmonia calmly explained that despite his appearance, Decamara was very talented in his field. The lady began to praise the guy in every possible way, who quickly became embarrassed and began to look even more frightening. Although the heroine could not even imagine this man sewing, she still decided to trust her teacher. So Hestia quickly assured that there were things more important to her than status, and suggested that they start working as soon as possible. In response, Decamar even shed tears, and noted that the Marquise was indeed very kind, as Madame had said. The girl really didn't even think of objecting to her teacher's offer of help, because she needed a dress. But the extent to which Harmonia loved to be friends with people from different classes could not help but surprise the heroine. A few minutes later, the lady took a dress out of her suitcase and said that she would like to have this one altered. Miss also brought some jewelry just in case, since she didn't know what exactly might be useful. Without saying a word, Decamar immediately began to examine the material of the fabric and what the Marquise had brought for him. Unexpectedly, after a few seconds, the guy started asking so many questions that Hestia didn't have time to answer them. In the end, the girl said that she completely trusted the tailor in everything, since she could not say anything. The only thing the Marquise asked was that her dress not ultimately stand out too much from the others. Suddenly, Decimar's eyes sparkled, and he completely stopped listening to the lady who was expressing her wishes. Bowing his head over the table, the guy shouted that he had just come up with the perfect sketch of a dress for the Marquise. So he said he would draw it before he completely forgot, and then quickly ran off to get some paper, as if it had never been there. The heroine could not understand why the tailor asked her so many questions if he still worked out of inspiration. Seeing the lady's extremely surprised face, Harmonia laughed reservedly, because she knew about Decamar's behavior. The teacher supported her student by listing the number of things she had managed to do, even though she had not yet picked out an outfit. Hestia herself agreed that she had accomplished a lot, but she hoped that her efforts would not ultimately be in vain. Looking at the lady again, Madame suddenly said that she would like the princess to behave just as diligently. The Marquise did not expect to hear such words, so she turned around with interest and asked if something was wrong with Diana. Harmony immediately realized that she had said the wrong words, so she corrected herself, explaining that everything was perfectly fine. The heroine assumed that this thought had escaped from Madame because rumors had been spreading about the saint recently, but the girl didn't know all the details, so she decided to deal with it later. Suddenly, the teacher very confidently and sharply declared that all the rumors were simply lies and gossip of aristocrats. For some reason, the woman still trusted the prince's wife unconditionally, no matter what anyone said about her. The heroine remembered that this happened because in the novel, Harmonia and Diana were strongly connected to each other, but Hestia had a feeling that the saint would soon cease to be as attractive to others as before. Suddenly, Decamar burst into the room very sharply, since he had managed to finish several sketches of the dress at once. The tailor admitted that he was so inspired that he made many options at once, but was ready to consider each one. The Marquise took the papers in her hands and immediately began to study them very carefully, trying not to miss anything. But for some reason, the guy managed to sadly think that the girl didn't like absolutely anything. At some point, he noticed that the lady was periodically glancing at his chest and discovered that he was unbuttoned. As a result, he quickly buttoned up and apologized for not even noticing how his clothes had come undone. However, Hestia wasn't at all angry at the guy, because she considered it much more important that they had to choose a design. The lady went through sketch after sketch and saw how beautiful they were, even though they had only just been thought up. Suddenly, the Marquise reached the very last sketch, which for some reason had been worked on much less than the others. Noticing the girl's interest, Decamar sheepishly explained that he had drawn it only to stretch his fingers. But the heroine had already made her choice, so she told the tailor with a smile that she liked this particular dress. At this moment, even in the Marquis's estate, there was a commotion among the maids before the upcoming grand tea party. Kaelus wanted to sleep longer today, but woke up very early because he could hear the commotion outside the door too clearly. The butler politely explained that today the lady was going to have tea at the palace, and that's why everyone around was worried. In response, the guy just sluggishly turned away, pretending that he was absolutely not interested in everything that was happening in the estate. Then Uros, as if by chance, said that the lady would like a new dress, and this had already reached Kael's ears. Noticing that the gentleman was listening, the assistant reported that the lady even had to alter her existing outfit. Kaelus was surprised when he realized that the miss, on principle, did not use his money, but found a way out herself. Even the servants would never have believed that Hestia's dress had been altered, as it looked stunning. The Marquise was very pleased with the impression she made, so she accepted compliments from everyone present with a smile. The maid admitted that she was very worried about altering the dress, but in the end, it looks even better than new. In response, Hestia stated that it was all thanks to Dekamaru, who stood nearby and also enjoyed his work. The assistants immediately began to whisper that the tailor was a commoner, but the lady did not care at all. On the contrary, the lady liked the fact that no one could believe that such a clumsy and huge man had created the outfit. In fact, even Hessie couldn't imagine that the dress would end up being so beautiful. The girl even deliberately chose a very simple design from the start, deciding that it would be quite sufficient for tea drinking. So, even though the madam and the tailor desperately tried to convince her of her bad choice, the miss did not change her mind. The heroine herself understood perfectly well that all the other sketches were much better, but she wanted something less elegant. The lady knew that everyone would be watching her at this first great tea party, and so she intended to stand out. Therefore, the girl confidently stated that she needed exactly this kind of clothing to show her status and responsibilities. This argument somewhat calmed Harmonia and Decimara, although they still believed that this sketch was not suitable. However, Hestia had something interesting in mind, so she decided to calm the guy down by telling him her plan. It turned out that the girl asked to decorate this simple dress with powder from pink and mother-of-pearl shells. The guy was especially happy because he could now personally use this method, which was cheap. The whole point was that before moving into the novel, the heroine often looked at different fashion magazines and remembered everything. But even so, if it weren't for Decamar's true skill, the lady would never have been able to achieve such a result. Hestia understood perfectly well that the tailor had tried very hard, and therefore was sincerely grateful to him for everything. The guy was very surprised when the Marquise suddenly approached him personally and expressed her gratitude in front of everyone. The lady asked with a smile if she could go to the tailor again, which made him almost cry once again. Unexpectedly for everyone, Kaelus appeared in the room, who said that the door was open, which is why he came in. The lady couldn't even imagine that her husband would come to her, so she was not at all mentally prepared for this. The girl immediately remembered that the Marquis had not come to her before, so she quickly went to meet him. Kael himself was in no hurry to explain the reasons for his appearance here, as he was staring at the dress on his wife. He looked the girl over carefully from head to toe, but could not find any signs that the outfit had been altered by anyone. Also suddenly, the guy handed the lady a bag of gold and asked her to immediately hand it over to the tailor. After which, having done everything he wanted, the gentleman turned around and walked away, not wanting to linger any longer. The assistants immediately began to whisper about this, since they loved to discuss various gossip. Hestia noticed out of the corner of her ear that the servants were telling each other that Kaelus didn't even appreciate her beauty, even though she was dressed up. Taking a deep breath and then exhaling, Miss reminded herself that everything was okay, because to the guy, only the saint was beautiful. The heroine herself believed that she could never compare in beauty to the princess, so she forbade herself to be upset. But then the Marquise again heard the voice of her husband, who for some reason quietly and slightly hesitantly called her. Although no one expected it, Kaelus suddenly declared that this dress suited his beautiful wife very well. At first, the girl thought that she had simply imagined these words, because the guy had never complimented anyone before. The lady sincerely believed that Kael could only praise Diana, so she did not understand when she herself suddenly received praise. However, since the miss still did not answer due to astonishment, the Marquis's face suddenly darkened again. So now he finally turned away and wished his wife a good time at today's tea party. Although in fact the Marquis said only one compliment, the girl had already become very embarrassed because she loved him. Watching Kael go, the lady once again remembered how much the princess had once meant to him. So the fact that the guy suddenly went to meet his wife for some reason already said a lot to her. Unexpectedly for herself, Hestia realized that ever since she came to this estate, the master had come here himself. After all the time before this, it was Miss who visited his room and received all the necessary advice and instructions there. And now Kaelus announced that he had simply brought the required budget, and this incredibly touched the Marquise. So, before the guy finally disappeared into the corridor, Hessie quickly called out to him, forcing him to turn around. When the Marquis looked at her, the girl smiled sweetly and thanked him for coming to cheer her up. Although Kael's face remained gloomy, he still nodded politely and calmly in response, after which he left. Already in the office, Uros began asking the gentleman many questions, as he was incredibly curious about all of this. In response, Kaelus somewhat nervously asked his assistant not to bother him, but to let him rest in peace now alone. But the butler still couldn't calm down, because he was glad that the gentleman had decided to support his wife. In fact, the guy himself was not entirely sure why he had done such a thing for the sake of a girl. Hestia's sweet and bright smile popped into his mind, which was very different from Diana's smile, but he still remembered it. At this moment, the heroine had already arrived at the Imperial Palace because she did not want to be late for tea. She was almost immediately met by Countess Erenice, who complimented her secret acquaintance on her appearance. The lady admitted that she was a little nervous before the event, and the woman shared her emotions in response. Hessie was surprised when Erenice again, for some reason, reminded her that she would be completely on her side tonight. After which the Countess said that she was not entirely sure how right it was to come up with something like that. But what worried Hestia at that moment was that the tea party was ultimately taking place in the Emperor's main palace, and not in the prince's estate. This meant that Helios was very worried about his father's well-being, which is why he asked his wife to spend everything here. Since the change of location did not affect the Marquise's plans in any way, she calmly informed her ally about it, after which the lady smiled confidently and said that if the woman was worried, she could completely trust her. This kind of support was very pleasant for Erenice, despite the fact that she was already an adult and independent person. So, having come closer to each other, the allies began to whisper slyly, already anticipating how the tea party would go. A few minutes later, the princess herself finally appeared before her guests in a very beautiful dress. At the sight of her, all the aristocrats immediately fell silent, since according to etiquette, they had to bow politely. The heroine did not stand out from the crowd, because right now it was still too early for that. However, Hestia was not going to give up on her desire to show everyone the true face of Saint Diana. Without detaining anyone, the princess soon announced that she was glad to see everyone at her ceremonial event. In response, the already seated guests wished good luck to the imperial family, who had invited them to tea today. The Marquise was glad that she had managed to secure a seat at the same table as the prince's wife, which was only to her advantage. Other girls praised Diana's kindness and virtue simply because she remembered to invite them. But the lady couldn't stand the fact that the celebration in the main palace was considered by everyone as a manifestation of Helios's love. Moreover, due to the large amount of noise around, Miss quickly realized that it would be difficult for her to find time for her speech. So the Marchioness decided to give Diana some time so that she could fully enjoy the moments of her glory. Looking at the princess, Hestia couldn't help but notice that she now looked like someone that everyone loved very much. But when the heroine read the novel, the saint was not at all so friendly to everyone, which surprised her. But the girl had reread the story many times because of her beloved Kael, so she knew the plot too well. It was then that Hessie was finally able to make eye contact with the princess, which would allow him to start a conversation. But to the great displeasure of the miss, Diana immediately looked away, as if she intended to continue to ignore the Marchioness. This impudent behavior made Hestia even more angry, and she practically demanded that the saint look her in the eyes. After some time, the girl realized with a sigh that she would have to take the initiative into her own hands if she wanted to get anything. Here the princess announced to all the guests that the sweets that she had personally prepared for everyone had finally arrived. The aristocrats immediately began to grab the delicacy, since they were very afraid of not pleasing Diana in any way. But the heroine herself, upon seeing what was prepared, even had her eyes pop out of her head in surprise, because the food was very simple. Hestia remembered very well that such a modest treat was available to all commoners at any time. The lady guessed that the saint had specially prepared everything according to her own wishes and tastes in order to shame the aristocrats. But this criticism of the excessive luxury of noble ladies was ultimately not liked by anyone. But thanks to this situation, Miss was finally able to fully understand what Diana had been like all this time. After all, everything came very easily to the girl, and she was extremely arrogant and did not value even the simplest things in her life. And this stupidity combined with impudence played very much into the heroine's hands, so she couldn't help but grin. At this moment, the princess, as if nothing had happened, offered everyone to drink tea, which she also prepared herself. Suddenly, Hestia declared to everyone that the saint had prepared all this so as not to forget her origin, after which the Marchioness specifically asked everyone around whether the aristocrats agreed with her modest assumption. Although at that moment no one supported the lady due to surprise, she continued to speak. The aristocrats fully agreed that the treat was too simple for them, but they were afraid to talk about it. Diana, however, flinched sharply when Hestia asked if something bad had happened to the skilled and knowledgeable Madame Merope. When the saint asked in response why the lady had decided so, she explained with a smile that she simply did not feel the lady-in-waiting's participation. The marquise did not say it directly, but due to gossip among the maids, almost everyone already knew the truth about Merope. It was unclear for what reason, but Madame decided not to participate in this tea party, which raised many questions. The fact that the princess had some problems with her maid of honor immediately spread throughout the hall and became the main news. At the same time, Diana herself, who did not expect such a turn of events, was still desperately trying to keep her face. So she said with a smile that, as the wife of the prince himself, she had the right to hold tea parties the way she wanted. The saint explained that she had decided to break the ancient customs a little, since she had become quite tired of them. But even with such reasoning, the aristocrats were in no hurry to try the simple treats that had been prepared. Diana hoped that the ladies would understand her idea, but was suddenly surprised to discover that she did not find support. The princess looked around in frustration, trying unsuccessfully to find at least one interested look. Hestia did not miss the moment, and reported that surely at least someone would understand the deep meaning imparted by the saint. Although the prince's wife guessed that the marquise was insincere, she still had to maintain a dialogue with her. The heroine did not expect this, because she expected that the princess would be much more embarrassed in this situation. Suddenly, to the girl's great surprise, Diana attacked back and said that the lady should have dressed more appropriately. At first, the marquise didn't even believe that the saint had just so calmly scolded her sparkling outfit. As a result, Hessie really wanted to say something in response, but she knew that now was not the right time. The marquis's wife guessed that the saint had mistakenly taken her altered dress for a very expensive one that had been recently purchased. But Diana's own clothes were also very beautiful, so the princess acted extremely illogically. The heroine even went into shock for a while from the realization of all this, until the countess brought her to her senses. Without thinking twice, Aranis gently tapped the saucer with her finger, a secret call to action between the allies. Hestia immediately remembered what that double click meant, because she had personally suggested it the day before the tea party. So now, no matter what the lady said, the madam had to wait for the right moment and support her words. As a result, Miss was very happy inside herself, because she was glad to have someone on her side. So she rose from her seat and, bowing politely, explained to the princess that some misunderstanding had occurred. Standing in full view of everyone, the marquise admitted that her dress had recently been altered from her favorite outfit. The prince's wife could not even imagine that the clothes sparkled so brightly because they were decorated with shells and not precious stones. Hestia took a huge risk by revealing her secret to the noblewomen, as they immediately began to gossip. However, the heroine was completely prepared for this, as she had planned everything well in advance. Suddenly, several noble ladies approached the marquise and admitted that they had not been able to take their eyes off her dress all this time. Arenas watched silently from the side for now, but at the same time carefully remembered everyone who approached the miss. Meanwhile, the aristocrat asked with genuine curiosity if Hestia would tell who her tailor was. In response, the marquise smiled, guessing that she would be of great help to Dekomaru, since none of the madams knew about him yet. So the lady, without any embarrassment, reported that even her dressmaker was ultimately a commoner. This news surprised the women even more, as they could not believe that the poor man had such talent. There was an immediate uproar, as the aristocrats did not believe that Dekomar had actually made the outfit. Their distrust and disdain even made the heroine feel a little sad, because she could not change it in any way. Suddenly, the Countess finally spoke up and said that she would never have been able to guess the tailor's origins. The woman noted somewhat absent-mindedly that the culture and skills of the common people turned out to be quite good. So Madame finally concluded that she would also like to receive some dress from Master Hestia. Only after a few minutes did the princess suddenly feel that all attention had somehow shifted to the Marquise. Moreover, the women suddenly began to say that they were ashamed of their expensive outfits, which surprised the saint even more. As a result, the prince's wife could not contain her emotions, and among all those present, only the heroine noticed this. Hessie watched her rival closely, and therefore saw that she was even ready to die from frustration. The Marchioness understood perfectly well that Diana actually wanted all the attention to be focused on her. The princess thought that everyone around her would accept her opinion and join her only because she had a very high status. And in her dreams, the saint imagined many times how joyfully she would smile at the end of the organized tea party. But it turned out that Hestia, even without straining herself too much, was already able to significantly surpass her rival. However, her performance with Erinys was not yet over, so the Countess spoke again. She smiled slyly and asked if the Marquis really didn't allocate any money for his wife, since she had to have her dress altered. The heroine immediately turned on the actress and tried to make her facial expression as confused and surprised as possible. Although in fact both allies thought in advance what they would talk about this topic, and even tried to lead up to it. That's why Hestia was screaming loudly and joyfully inside herself at that moment, although she couldn't tell anyone about it. Even before the tea party began, they agreed that they would definitely try to naturally talk about Kaelus. But the heroine herself didn't know all this time how to move on to the most important discussion and interest the ladies. However, Erinys was able to broach the subject so easily and casually that Hestia was amazed. So right now, the lady smiled back at her and reassured her, telling her that she hadn't asked anything bad at all. The princess lowered her head even lower when she heard that the Marquis had personally taken care of the dress for his wife. The Marquise continued to watch the defeated Diana out of the corner of her eye and was very pleased with the result. And indeed, the saint shrank even more when she heard that Kaelus completely respected Hessie as his wife. So the heroine tried to speak as loudly as possible so that the princess could clearly hear all her answers to the questions. After a few minutes, the Countess decided that it was time to move on to something even more serious, and therefore touched on Helios. Imagine Diana's surprise when Erinys stated that her husband had strongly criticized the Marquis' coldness. The princess immediately guessed that they were talking about the situation when Kaelus personally dealt with the Orcus family of villains. Unexpectedly for the saint, Hestia suddenly announced that she believed that her husband had acted very correctly that day, after which she turned to the princess and asked if she really thought that Kael was actually wrong. This incident, in which the Marquis forced the Duke and his daughter to drink poisoned tea, was not so simple. This is because Kaelus initially had serious reasons for acting in this way with this family. The Orcus were causing too many problems for the Empire, so Helios slammed his fist on the table every time they were mentioned. The guy was sincerely against his friend dealing with these harmful aristocrats on his own, but the Marquis understood only too well that the prince could not under any circumstances ruin his reputation. Heli himself knew that he couldn't do anything, otherwise Duke Orcus would begin to counterattack. Then Kael put a reassuring hand on the boy's shoulder and reminded him that he was obliged to always support the Emperor's family. The Marquis himself believed in his own argument that all this was necessary for his friend and their good ruler. Moreover, the guy sincerely wanted to help Diana, but she herself did not even think about the reason for his actions that day. So Hestia began to defend her husband even more strongly, convincing him that the Duke would cause a lot of trouble. But the princess was sure that no goal should justify the means that the Marquis ultimately chose. The saint reminded that there were laws in the Empire that Kaelus, among others, had to follow. In response, the lady asked why the guy was not punished according to the laws of the country, and Diana did not know what to answer. The princess's confusion immediately brought a satisfied smile to the heroine's face, because she realized that she had driven her rival into a dead end. The saint now faced an extremely difficult choice, and she herself did not know whether to agree or to deny. The prince's wife faced such unpleasant circumstances for the first time in her life, so she remained silent. And all this was only to the heroine's advantage, because it completely exposed the duplicity of the princess's nature to everyone. After about half a minute, the girl realized that her silence had dragged on for too long, although she had not come up with any words. The princess even squeezed her fingers tightly, but even this did not help her come up with any answer. Imagine Diana's surprise when the Countess suddenly stood up for her and asked the Marquise to calm down. Berenice was absolutely certain that Hestia had pushed the saint too hard, and so she asked her to stop. For the princess, this sudden protection was extremely unexpected and pleasant, so she immediately blossomed. At this moment, the heroine pretended that she truly regretted how much she had managed to say to the prince's wife. The girl even expressed hope that Diana would be able to generously spare her for such cruel words. The saint glanced at her reflection in the tea to look calm, and then gallantly let the marquise go. No one noticed, but Hestia, leaving the tea party even earlier, was very happy that her plan had completely succeeded. Now the unsuspecting saint was in Berenice's hands, so the lady had no more to do. Since the lady had become tired from all these dialogues, she went out into the imperial garden to rest at least a little. Being sure that she was completely alone, the miss even allowed herself to relax and think a little out loud. Suddenly, out of nowhere, the crown prince appeared next to the marquise, whom she had not expected to see at all. Due to the unexpectedness, Hestia was completely unable to hide her emotions and accidentally broke all the rules of etiquette. But the guy didn't seem to pay attention to this, since his face remained just as impenetrable. The heroine was still trying to understand why His Majesty suddenly came out into the garden where she was sitting quietly. But what surprised the lady most was that Heli suddenly approached her sharply, as he wanted to ask several questions. The atmosphere around the two of them immediately became very romantic, although neither the guy nor the girl did anything for it. But Hessie didn't want any romance with the heir, so she made a very scary and unpleasant face. In response, Helios reminded her that he was actually a prince, and for some reason the marquise didn't even say hello when she saw him. But the heroine was not at all confused, and explained to the guy that he did not even give her time to say anything to him. Only the prince reminded that the lady was only a marchioness, and the miss had to come to terms with the rank system. Suddenly, the heir asked what the girl was doing alone in the garden, if the princess's tea party was in full swing. Helios hit the nail on the head when he asked if something bad had happened between Hestia and Diana. But the lady did not want to admit anything, so she tried to change the subject and asked what the prince himself was doing here. The guy calmly stated that he was walking into the hall for an event when he heard heavy sighs and decided to check what was going on. The heroine immediately guessed that the heir would still find out a little later why she left the saint in the garden. So Miss honestly admitted that she had shown disrespect to Diana and therefore left for a while, which surprised Helios. His Majesty immediately perked up and began to demand that the marquise tell him about the situation in more detail. In response, Hestia stated that she simply wanted to restore her husband's honor and accidentally insulted the princess in front of everyone. The fact that the girl was still smiling, despite the fact that she had done something wrong, completely drove Heli crazy. He clenched his fist tightly, as he didn't think the marquise would use Kaelus to fight the saint. At this moment, the heroine carefully observed the prince's emotions, but did not show her own. So she was able to calmly say that their reasons for protecting their partners were very similar. Upon hearing this, the heir did not even believe the lady at first, since he believed that she was much more selfish. However, if we are to believe the girl's words, she sincerely loved the marquis and therefore tried in every way to help him. At this moment, although the boy and girl did not notice it, Kael accidentally saw them and therefore stopped nearby. The thing is that a few hours ago, the gentleman unexpectedly received a letter asking him to visit the imperial palace. Since Kaelus didn't have much to do right now anyway, he decided to leave immediately. The only thing that bothered the marquis was the possible meeting with the princess, because he was not ready for it. Suddenly, while thinking about the saint, the guy felt a sharp headache, which made him groan and frighten the butler. Euros did not know what exactly was happening to his master, but immediately suggested calling a doctor just in case. And Kael himself at that moment hoped that he would not meet Diana today, because she would be hosting a tea party. Suddenly, an image of a smiling Hestia appeared in his head, happily thanking her husband for the compliment. For some reason, this memory almost immediately cleared Kaelus's head, which surprised him, so he quickly headed to the palace, where Emperor Carius greeted his faithful marquis with a sincere smile. The ruler immediately began asking questions about Kael's wife, which he actually did not expect to hear at all. In the end, His Majesty had to admit that he had called his old friend out of pure curiosity before his recent wedding. The Marquis guessed that all the other matters were just a pretext for dialogue, so he began to list Hestia's shortcomings. But at the end, unexpectedly even for himself, he finished his speech with the words that the girl still sincerely cares about him. Imagine Kaelus's surprise when the Emperor, having listened to him attentively, suddenly said that the lady really loved her husband. All this time, the guy didn't even think about what feelings the girl actually had for him. However, if the smiling miss really loved the Marquis, then a lot became clear and understandable to him. Suddenly, Kael came back from his memories to the present and heard Hestia screaming that she loved someone. The guy didn't know what exactly was going on between his wife and his ex-friend, but he decided to eavesdrop just in case. The atmosphere between the two was clearly not conducive to a normal friendly conversation, but they were alone. Suddenly, Helios demanded that the Marquise explain why she loved her husband so much, whom she had never even seen before. Since the lady remained suspiciously silent, her head down, the prince decided that she simply had nothing at all to say. How suddenly, with shining eyes, the girl began to list a huge number of reasons for her love for Kael. The heir could not even imagine that anyone would be able to name as many arguments as Hestia at that moment. As a result, the Marquis, who had been eavesdropping on all of his wife's words, even felt a little ashamed of the way he had found out everything. So, thinking that the lady might really love him, the guy hurried away so as not to be noticed. At this point, Hessie got so worked up that she even felt real anger at the heir for asking her the question. Since she had nothing else to do during tea time, Miss decided to return home and talk to Irenis later. Imagine the tired girl's surprise when she suddenly discovered a familiar silhouette ahead. Hestia never thought that Kaelus would decide to visit the Imperial Palace again because he did not want to meet Diana. When the Marquise ran up to her husband in excitement, he calmly explained that he had come on personal business. Suddenly, it dawned on the heroine that the guy had just called her by a pet name, something he had never done before. Because of this, Hestia froze in place, as it seemed to her that everything that was happening around her was actually a dream. At the same time, for some reason, Kaelus himself continued to behave as if he had done nothing unusual at that moment. However, the lady herself could not cope with her heart beating wildly from excitement and surprise. Although the girl remained as calm as possible outwardly, inside she was seething and screaming because of what had happened. As a result, Hestia even realized that she couldn't really stand on her own feet, so she accepted the butler's help. Kael, who had already managed to climb into the carriage, noticed that the miss gave her hand to the assistant, and not to him. At this point, the servant asked if everything was all right with the lady, and she stubbornly declared that she was ready to go to the estate. Suddenly, the Marquise realized that she had not told her husband exactly where the tea party would take place. But for some reason, the lady couldn't bring herself to ask the guy this question right now, while they were together. And at that moment, Kaelus was trying to understand why the lady didn't ask him for help at all, if she loved him. When they arrived at the estate, the Marquis was the first to jump out of the carriage, because he wanted to offer his hand to his wife. This surprised the heroine so much that she once again froze in place, because she did not know what to do. The girl reminded Kael, extremely excited, that it wasn't her birthday today, so he didn't have to try so hard. However, the guy didn't even think about it, although Hestia was still worried that there was some kind of catch in her husband's behavior. But even the assistants around told Miss that she just needed to lean on the gentleman's arm, so she decided to do it. Although the Marquise was still very nervous about doing this, she nevertheless offered the boy her hand to help. Afterwards, when Kaelus helped her down, Hessie was even able to thank him in a voice that did not waver from embarrassment. The guy said absolutely nothing in response, because he just wanted to enjoy this wonderful moment for him. As for Hestia, she absolutely did not remember what happened to her next, because she was so happy about the attention of her beloved. As a result, when the lady opened her eyes, it was already too late to get up, although the miss did not even suspect it. All the events of this long evening were as if in a fog, but the heroine was firmly convinced that she had not drunk the night before. For some reason, the Marquise still felt very happy, although there was no longer any reason for it. Hestia planned to do some work as she needed to tidy up her memories of the novel. But in the end, the girl decided to just go to bed in order to maintain such a wonderful mood as long as possible. Only when she was almost asleep did the lady suddenly realize that she had never been as happy since she got into the affair as she was now. That same evening, the princess asked her husband in confusion if she had done something wrong several years ago. The heir was already getting ready for bed, so he didn't expect that the girl would suddenly begin to suffer from incomprehensible pangs of conscience. Finally, Helios asked what the matter was and stated in advance that the saint could do absolutely nothing wrong. But these words didn't even slightly encourage Diana, because her doubts were much stronger this time. So the lady confessed that the Marchioness had recently asked why her husband had not been punished according to the laws of the empire if he had been guilty. The crown prince immediately remembered how Hestia had smiled sweetly and insisted that she simply loved the Marquis. Before the guy could say anything to his wife, she suddenly burst into tears, saying that she couldn't do anything to resist Hessie. What tormented the princess most was the question of whether she should not have properly condemned her former friend. In response, Helios sat down in front of the girl and comfortingly said that he did not doubt her high morals at all. He himself understood that Kaelus committed such a terrible act only for the good of the empire and his close friends. And then the saint did not scold the guy, which meant that she hoped for their happy reunion in the future. But only recently did the prince realize that this would not happen, because he had been too complacent and selfish all this time. As a result, his best friend began to hate him instead of love him, which greatly hurt the heir. However, Helios did not think that he had the right to stop the fleeing Marquis in any way now and try to bring him back. Right now, the prince blamed only himself for the loss of his closest friend and did not know what to do next. Therefore, when the wife shared her doubts with the guy, he also ended up thinking even more deeply. The girl admitted that she was counting on support from her husband, but at the moment, Heli did not know what was right. So, completely out of the blue for Diana, the heir asked if perhaps they should finally make peace with the Marquis. The girl couldn't even stand it from the emotions that overwhelmed her and jumped up from her seat while the guy was trying to explain everything. The princess recalled that she had lived her entire life without ever giving up her own beliefs and rules. That is why the saint was afraid of what could happen to her life if she suddenly forgave Kael so easily. Seeing the tears on his wife's face, Helios immediately cast aside all thoughts, as he only wanted to help her. So the prince hugged his beloved tightly and asked her to forget everything he had just dared to say. The lady did not answer, but only silently pressed herself against the air, feeling the tears still flowing down her face. The next morning, Hestia was very surprised when the butler suddenly brought her several letters at once. Miss had been waiting for news from Madame Harmony for several days, but she could not even imagine that Helios himself would suddenly write to her. Without a moment's hesitation, as she was burning with curiosity, the heroine quickly opened the envelope to find out the contents of the letter. But inside, there were words that the Marquise had not expected at all, so she was even more surprised. The fact was that the heir wrote to the Marquise about how rudely she had treated his wife at yesterday's tea party. At the same time, Helios, in a commanding tone, demanded that Hestia come to the palace as soon as possible and ask the saint for forgiveness. The heroine even angrily squeezed the letter in her hands out of displeasure, although she had not even read it properly to the very end. Seeing such an angry lady, the assistant decided that it would be better to leave her alone with herself for at least some time. The Marchioness knew perfectly well that the tea party had ended in a friendly atmosphere, including due to the sudden appearance of the prince. But even Helios could not correct the fact that rumors began to spread among the aristocrats, each of whom condemned the saint more and more. The biggest question amid all this gossip was whether Diana really still despised the upper class. What offended Hestia most was that the prince had softened all these conversations simply by his appearance. So right now, the miss was having a hard time brainstorming, while the butler didn't understand what was happening to her. As a result, having failed to find answers to most of her questions, the Marquise decided to at least request an audience with the saint. Then suddenly, an idea came into the head of Euros, who wanted to somehow help the worried lady. So the butler loudly asked if the lady would like to have tea today, which greatly frightened the girl who was in her thoughts. As a result, the old man quickly ran for the kettle, and Hestia didn't even have time to say anything after him. The assistant's ability to quickly help brought a sincere smile to the heroine's face, after which she relaxed. While waiting for the cup of delicious tea that Euros had promised her, the girl decided to continue sorting through the letters that had been brought. And the first thing Hessie did was open the envelope from Harmony, and was very surprised by what she read. For this reason, the lady left her room very quickly, running down the corridor right past the assistants. At that moment, the maid was arguing with the butler about the right to take tea to the lady, when suddenly she ran away. This behavior greatly surprised the servants, and they all shouted after Hestia that her tea had long been ready. Since the heroine's head was overflowing with thoughts, she couldn't even immediately think of what to do with the delicious drink. In the end, the Marquise asked to leave the kettle in her office, and she herself ran on so as not to stop along the way. Neither the butler nor the maid could understand where exactly the young lady was in such a hurry at that time, and the girl herself rushed very quickly to the Marquis, who today decided to properly study watercolor painting. No matter how urgent the girl's news was, she could not help but enjoy the beautiful appearance of her lover. Suddenly, the Marquis, who was tired of waiting for the miss to come to her senses, asked what was so urgent about her. In response, Hestia calmly reported that Madame had managed to find out that the temple had begun to openly criticize her. When the lady read this letter personally, she was even amused by the phrases about how she was blinded by profit and therefore inhuman. The Marquise immediately guessed that the priest did not have the courage to openly oppose her, and they did so. The worst thing for Hessie was that if the aristocrats spoke out against Diana, the prince and the temple would immediately begin to protect her. So, clenching her fist on the table, the heroine desperately tried to think of something that would cause great harm to the church. From the original story, the girl knew that the temple was originally intended to heal people from illnesses. Since ordinary people could not afford expensive doctors, they lined up for help at the temple. The thought flashed through the Marquise's mind that she needed to stop the flow of people constantly coming for treatment. After this, the lady jumped up happily, as she was finally able to find the solution to this problem that she needed. So right now, the wife told the Marquis that she was going to improve the personal hygiene of ordinary people. The guy, who had now completely turned away from drawing, was very surprised to hear such a strange idea. However, he agreed that many diseases could be avoided if people started washing their hands with soap. Hestia has already come up with an option where they won't add essential oils to the product, which will make it cheaper. Without letting the girl finish speaking, Kaelus suddenly interrupted her and asked if she was really suggesting that he open a soap factory. But the Marquise had no intention of resorting to her husband's help and came only to share her plan with him. Imagine the master's surprise when Hestia suddenly asked him for permission to now act on his behalf. Also, although terribly shy, the lady said that she also needed at least a small amount of startup capital. But then the Marquis declared that Miss would not need all this, and she froze in place in complete shock because she did not understand why. In response, Kaelus explained that on his fertile land, there was just an abandoned workshop that Hessie could take. The heroine could not even dream of such an offer, because she simply took this area from the temple. But then Kael surprised his wife even more, because he unexpectedly suggested that they go there together. Hearing these words, the girl immediately froze in place, because at first, she thought that she was just imagining things. The heroine's brain categorically refused to accept the fact that her beloved personally suggested a trip together. In order to collect her thoughts, the lady even had to turn away from her husband, because this was the only way she could think normally. She even specifically asked Kael to at least stay away from her for a little while, so that it would become a little easier for her. But since even this did not help, the miss urgently hid in the room, trying in vain to calm her frantic heartbeat. The Marquis watched the lady closely all this time and concluded that she instantly became much happier. And the heroine herself had serious doubts about whether she could really go on this trip with her lover. But then Kael unexpectedly entered the room, and as a result, Hestia now had no time to think. The guy wanted to hear from the lady that she wanted to go, so he asked her not to be afraid to speak about her desires. The Marquise was horrified when the gentleman suddenly suggested that she did not want to go anywhere with him, which was why she was silent. So the girl tried to explain as naturally as possible that she was simply worried about her beloved's comfort. Hestia stated that she could easily visit the workshop herself, so the guy didn't have to go with her at all. Suddenly, Kaelus frightened the Marquise with the words that everyone around him believed that he was very and seriously ill. Even the fact that the butler performed all his duties very well did not help to get rid of speculation. The girl couldn't even imagine that everything was so serious, so she nervously clenched her fists along with her dress. And Kael said that all this gossip would disappear as soon as he appeared in public at least once in the company of his wife. However, despite all the difficulties that arose, the Marquis did not believe that the young lady was failing to fulfill her duties. The girl herself did not expect that the guy would unexpectedly sincerely praise her for the work she had done for him. Hestia had no idea how important it was for her to hear at least something good from her beloved. Looking at him and listening to his voice, the heroine felt how quickly all her worries disappeared. Once again, the Marquise understood for herself what exactly gives her strength and meaning to live, because she did not want to exist without Kael. So she thanked the gentleman in return, who for some reason suddenly became gloomy because he suddenly became thoughtful. Kaelus realized that on the trip, he would have to face his memories anyway, which was difficult. However, the lady had done so much for him that the Marquis simply could not refuse her even such a trifle now. If before the guy invested but did not receive any return, now he felt the efforts of the miss and wanted to respond. So, in order not to delay further decision, Kaelus confidently suggested going this week, and Hestia immediately gasped. She remembered that she still had to ask Diana for forgiveness, so anxiety overwhelmed the girl again. But for her personally, The trip with her beloved was much more important than some apology to the smug princess. However, in this situation, the lady could not make the wrong choice, because then she would face the wrath of the heir. Kael guessed that his wife hadn't answered him yet because she had some things to do this week. The guy wanted to suggest rescheduling the trip, but Hestia, with shining eyes, declared that she would manage everything herself. This enthusiasm somewhat frightened Kaelus, but he did not object in response, only supported the lady. So literally the next day, when the princess was ready for this, the heroine immediately came to her palace. In reality, Hessie would have liked to avoid all of this, but she simply saw it as part of the job. Even though Diana guessed that the apology was implausible, the Marquise didn't care at all. The girl bowed politely and said that she was very sorry that the saint at the tea party was disappointed in her. The princess flinched a little when the miss mentioned her moral principles, but she did not know what to say in response. In the end, the prince's wife declared that she believed the words of her guest, and Hestia smiled at her gratefully. After which, since the heroine was in a great hurry to get on with the trip, she once again asked for forgiveness and was about to leave. But then the princess suddenly stopped her guest because she had another very important question. Hestia was greatly surprised when Diana suddenly asked if she had seen anything else about the emperor's sudden fall. This question immediately made the lady think, and she asked if some misfortune had befallen the saint. And the girl decided that it would be better if she did not deny anything, because everything would become known later. So the saint said that the ruler had become ill the previous night, but she was nearby, so she was able to help in time. But Hestia immediately guessed that if everything had ended well, then Dee would not have asked about the future. Therefore, the Marquise asked if the saint had problems with her powers, which immediately frightened the girl. Not wanting to admit this terrible truth, the saint jumped up on the spot and declared that everything was perfectly fine with her. But at the end of her angry speech, even the princess herself was not very sure of what she was saying. So the heroine finally came to the conclusion that Diana's powers were only getting weaker and weaker every day. And judging by the saint's reaction, she noticed that her power did not completely heal the emperor, so she asked for advice. However, Hestia decided to give the princess a small break and admitted that she had a vision about her. After which, with an inscrutable face, the Marquise declared that in less than 2 years, the saint's powers would disappear without a trace. As soon as the princess heard this terrible truth, her legs gave way and she almost fainted. Since Diana could not believe such a thing, she stated that this ability could not disappear because it was given to her by God. However, Hessie still decided to convey the truth to Diana, so she explained that her ability was also given by God. The saint did not like this information, which was noticeable by how much she shrank, although she did not say anything. The princess's reactions brought a smug smile to Hestia, who wanted to convince the girl of her rightness in any way. The heroine wanted the prince's wife to stop denying the fact that she would soon no longer be able to help people. To at least support the saint a little, the lady admitted that she herself was extremely surprised when she first saw this prediction. As soon as the Marquise said that she would like to tell Helios, Diana immediately asked her not to do it in fear. The girl got scared and got so excited that she even grabbed her rival tightly by the shoulders, begging her to keep quiet. The princess could barely say that she would tell her husband about everything a little later, but not now. The heroine was most surprised by the fact that Dee suddenly called her by name, as she was trying to win her favor. At the same time, the saint's hands continued to shake imploringly, and she herself continued to panic about the disappearance of her powers. The heroine was immediately reminded by this girl's behavior of the time when she also had a strange face and a desire to run away. Hestia didn't really understand what all this was about yet, so she decided to watch from the sidelines to at least understand something. So she nodded and said that since the princess was asking for it so desperately, she would remain silent and would not tell anyone anything. However, the Marquise did not finish there, as she leaned towards the saint and told her how this information could be hidden for much longer. In response, Diana's expression changed again as she once again sank into emotions of panic and helplessness because of what she had heard. But Hessie couldn't say anything more to the saint, so she said that it was time for her to return to her business. It remained a mystery to the heroine whether the prince and princess would be able to survive the loss of her powers or would still quarrel. Now Diana was like the protagonist of a novel who was somehow cruelly abandoned after a happy ending. Suddenly, the princess remembered how much the aristocrats discussed and hated her origin. The girl began to feel a lot of pressure from their past questions about what she could do at all, having been born into such a family. Suddenly, the lady remembered who exactly always saved and helped her in such a difficult and very oppressive situation for her from the outside. Each time, Helios and Kaelus tenderly consoled the saint, explaining that she truly deserved her gift of helping people. The guys almost in unison told the girl how special she was, and as a result, Diana herself believed in all of this. Moreover, common people were madly in love with the saint, who also helped them to cure almost any illness. So when the girl unexpectedly married the prince, for her it all happened as if it was supposed to. However, somewhere deep inside, Diana continued to not believe in what was happening, although everything around her remained quite real. The handsome heir, who loved her madly, promised during the wedding that he would never leave his wife alone. It was at that moment that the lady finally believed that she had powers, because she truly was special to God. But all this did not explain why the saint's healing abilities would soon dry up. At this moment, Kaelus, who was sitting in the carriage with the Marquise, noticed that she seemed to be upset about something. But Hestia was so carried away by admiring the guy's beauty that she didn't even notice that he said anything to her at all. A few minutes ago, the heroine almost packed the entire house with her on the trip just in case, barely stopping herself from doing so. So the couple were able to safely travel to the fertile land to choose a place for a soap factory. And Hessie didn't think at all about how she looked from the outside, because for her it was much more important to watch the handsome Kael. Although there will definitely be no meeting with Diana on this earth, the Marquis and his girlfriend used to often walk around the beautiful city. Moreover, it was in this place that the girl first struck Kaelus when she healed a man with her powers without hesitation. So, squeezing her hands tightly, the lady knew that for the guy this trip was a serious test in moral terms. Because of this, the heroine, looking at her husband, even thought that this trip should be rescheduled for a calmer time. Suddenly, Kael spoke up and asked if the miss had really gone to the estate with Uros, which surprised her greatly. Not waiting for an answer, the Marquis suggested that the land was disturbing the girl so much, and she began to deny it. Suddenly, the guy calmly told that his city Ilion was a very nice place, so Hessie would definitely like it there. The Marquise herself knew that this place was located on the edge of the river and was full of beautiful, noisy streets and people happy with life. The girl was even amazed at how closely this place matched the descriptions from the original story of the novel. The lady knew that when Diana healed the child, Kael felt both gratitude for it and shame. But the saint herself at that moment asked the guy not to say that, because she cured the child because she wanted to. Kael was very surprised when he heard only good words from his beloved in exchange for his walk with her. Diana smiled and said that in this place you can feel that people live and work to the fullest and for their own pleasure. Right now, while riding in the carriage with her husband, Hestia completely by accident repeated exactly the same words out loud. The Marquis remembered too well everything the princess had said about Ilion, so he instantly recognized this phrase. The heroine realized that she had really let herself down when the gentleman asked how she knew all these words. She covered her mouth with her hand in surprise, as she had no idea how to find a way out of this very strange situation. Suddenly, the carriage in which the couple was riding accidentally ran over a rock and shook those inside it violently. This event somewhat saved the lady, because she was very frightened and therefore delayed the moment of explanation. Kaelus noticed that the Marquise had turned pale, so he asked the confused girl if she was okay with everything. Hestia glanced at her beloved and realized that even in this situation, he was still beautiful. The girl didn't know why she was shaking so much because of the crookedly moving carriage, while the guy sat calmly in place. In the end, the lady decided that there was nothing wrong with her falling and disgracing herself, because everything was fine with her husband. Kaelus guessed from the girl's behavior that even in such a situation, she was primarily concerned about him and not about herself. Suddenly, the Marquis called out to the lady, somewhat alarmed, and Hestia looked at him in confusion, although she was afraid. Kael stood up and came closer, pointing out that the Marquise's ribbon had accidentally come loose from her hair due to the shaking of the carriage. At that moment, the assistant accidentally ran over another stone again, and the blow was so strong that even he ended up jumping. The servant was ashamed that this time he was unable to pull the cart normally because of the huge number of stones on the road. As it turned out, Hessie ended up falling on her side again, and Kael was hanging over her as he leaned on the seat to keep from falling. The guy immediately asked for forgiveness and wanted to move away, when suddenly the carriage began to skid again, and he remained in place. The heroine felt the light and pleasant aroma of the Marquis, and also felt his hair gently tickling her face. Hestia's head even started spinning from such closeness, since she had never been so close to her beloved before. Suddenly, Kaelus asked if the girl had been able to hear the phrases that Diana had spoken in her precognition. The lady had already completely forgotten about this incident when the guy reminded her, so she urgently confirmed his suspicions. After which the miss breathed a sigh of relief, since, although so unexpectedly, she got out of this confusing situation for herself. Suddenly, Kaelus said that he understood why it seemed to him that the girl knew more about the past than about the future. The heroine guessed that although the Marquis was still psychologically weak, his insight was at its best, and she should be more careful. Unexpectedly for the couple, the assistant suddenly knocked on the carriage door, as they had already arrived at their destination. The girl was so carried away by what was happening with the guy that she didn't even notice how they managed to stop. Jumping off the seat, Hestia hurried out into the street so as not to be embarrassed in her husband's company even more than before. Suddenly, to himself, Kaelus remembered the lady's face when she was all red from embarrassment because of him. But at this moment, the heroine had already managed to get to the place of the possible future soap factory and was pleasantly surprised. The place that the Marquis showed her was even larger than Miss had initially expected, trying to take the bare minimum. However, Kael confidently stated that this former place of entertainment was no longer needed by anyone, so he gave it away. But Hestia couldn't understand why such a good place remained empty for such a long time. In any case, the Marquise couldn't help but smile at the thought of how lucky she was to be able to start her own business. Hessie even thought that with this business, she would definitely be able to take care of her loved one, which made her very happy. Suddenly, Kael got down to business and asked if the girl had gathered all the soap makers needed for this event. The lady had to sadly admit that everyone she approached expressed complete disapproval and therefore refused. For common people, soap was like a work of art, so no one wanted to put it into the impersonal mass flow. The gentleman calmly listened to his wife's complaints that she had even brought in her friend Decamar, but it was all useless. The only thing is that for some reason the guy was interested in the details about the tailor who made the lady's dress, which surprised her. The heroine couldn't even imagine that Kaelus would suddenly ask how close she was to this guy of common origin. The lady immediately replied that they were just friends, and the Marquis asked if this man could attract people for business. Miss Still did not understand what her husband was leading her to, when suddenly he announced that he himself would gather all the necessary people for the matter. Hearing this, the girl immediately asked the young gentleman in bewilderment why he needed all this trouble. In response, Kael angrily asked if the Marquise really didn't need his help, and the lady quickly changed her mind and agreed to everything. The Marquis once again heard from his wife the words that he did not need to overdo it for her sake. Hestia was surprised when the boy replied that he had tried so hard, in part, for the sake of Ilion, who had managed to abandon it. Suddenly, Kael asked if a husband had no right to help his wife with her business, and this greatly surprised the heroine, who froze in place. She was even able to call him by name as a sign of gratitude, despite the fact that she blushed deeply and was embarrassed. Suddenly, the lady noticed that the assistants were very close to them and immediately jumped back as she blushed even more. And the gentleman himself was surprised when he heard from his assistants that some unexpected visitor had suddenly come to see him. The Marquis was sure that this building had been abandoned long ago, and therefore there should not have been any guests here at all. Before the servant could explain anything, the workshop doors swung open loudly, and an old man appeared on the threshold. It turned out to be an elder who had not seen Kael for so long that he was very afraid of not making it to this meeting with him. Only after this was the assistant able to report that the headman of Ilion, who had already managed to miss them very much, was in such a hurry to see them. Hestia noticed how tired the old man was from running so fast, and so she ran up to him worriedly. Kaelus didn't expect that his wife would somehow know the headman so well, unlike him. The guy even got the impression that the lady was much closer to the elder than to everyone else. Having greeted everyone around, the old man suddenly became interested and asked what had brought the company to this abandoned workshop. Instead of Hestia, Kael suddenly answered and said that he had come to show her the place where she would be doing business. But what surprised the heroine most was that the Marquis, for some reason, suddenly so openly and simply called her his wife. Kaelus himself behaved as if nothing too unusual had just happened to him. Although Hestia knew that they were indeed married on paper, she never heard her husband confirm this. Kaelus immediately noticed that his wife's joy quickly made him think something strange, but he said nothing. At that moment, the village headman promised that he would definitely help the lady equip this place for her business. The Marquise did not expect that the old man would suddenly express a desire to try his best just for her sake alone. The lady was grateful to her friend for this, because in reality she was just doing her own thing, and for some reason they were helping her. The Marquis watched the girl's emotions closely as he did not expect that other people would praise her so much. Suddenly, the guy called Hessie his wife again, and her heart once again skipped at least one beat out of habit. Suddenly, the headman expressed his warm gratitude for the fact that the embankment had been repaired, which surprised Kael. It turned out that the elder had been helping Hestia and Uros plan a budget to clean up the aftermath of the flood that year. Even though the flood brought Diana and Helios together, the common people ended up suffering greatly. Therefore, the heroine put a lot of effort into returning this territory to its original beautiful appearance. The old man understood perfectly well how much effort it took the lady to do this, so he was very grateful to her for her efforts. It was unclear why, but Hessie suddenly felt a pleasant warmth spreading throughout her body from the elder's words. A little later, when they came to visit, the old man put documents on the table in front of the couple and said that they could study them. Kaelus was the first to take the papers in his hands, since he did not expect the Marquise to deal with even such matters. Meanwhile, the girl handled all the accounting reports very skillfully, which noticeably surprised the young gentleman. He wondered to himself if the lady had really been able to do all this without any skillful help from anyone. Here, Kael noticed that Hestia had been looking at the documents with him, to which she explained that she simply had not seen the report yet. The Marquis was not greedy and showed the papers to Miss, for which she was very grateful to him, because she wanted to understand everything. Hessie began to study the documents intently, and Kael even asked if she had found a mistake, but everything was fine. The heroine confidently reported that this financial plan was not much different from the one she had originally come up with. At this moment, the elder watched the couple and could not help but smile, looking at their sweet and funny dialogues with each other. The lady explained to the Marquis that she learned something new every day, and that her skilled butler often helped her with this. Miss seriously believed that since she was now a marchioness, she was obliged to be able to deal with documents. After which she turned her gaze to the village elder and began to give him advice regarding the management of the city. The old man nodded in response to all of the lady's suggestions and assured her that he would do everything in the best possible way, so there was no need to worry. And Kaelus suddenly came to the conclusion that Hestia, although she herself did not notice it, very easily charmed the people around her. Unexpectedly, the elder suggested that the couple now take a look at the recently repaired embankment for themselves. He began to boast that the renovation was so good that it was absolutely necessary to see it with one's own eyes. The heroine herself wanted to take a walk, but she was very worried about Kael, who had once been here with Diana. At that moment, the Marquis was drinking tea quite calmly, so it was unclear what exactly he was thinking about now. Therefore, in order not to take her husband to a place where he had bad thoughts, the lady decided to refuse and come to the embankment alone. But then, when Hestia said that they would not go for a walk, at the same time Kaelus suddenly announced that they would go. The Marquise didn't expect the guy to suddenly announce that he would like to see the result of her efforts in the city right now. Moreover, Kael was sure that the dam would be a very good place for their first walk together in nature. But what surprised Hessie most of all was that the gentleman wanted to appear with her among people as real spouses. But for the guy himself, this desire was not at all surprising, so he remained just as calm. Rising to his feet, Kaelus extended his hand to the girl and personally suggested that she go for a walk along the embankment right now. The heroine was so surprised by everything that was happening that she stood there for a while with her mouth slightly open. She looked at her beloved with wide eyes and understood that her life next to such a beautiful man had become simply a fairy tale. So, although very timidly and hesitantly, the girl offered her hand to her husband with great pleasure. As they walked past the embankment, the lady constantly felt as if she had simply fallen into a real and long dream. Even the fact that she was unable to be completely alone with her beloved because of the servants did not upset the miss at all in the end. The only thing that really bothered Hestia was the distance at which the assistants somehow kept themselves. And what embarrassed the girl even more was that as soon as she looked at them, the servants immediately began to wink at her supportively. As a result, Hessie decided to focus on her own pleasant feelings, because she was holding her husband's hand. She even knew too well that the dam that was built was a beautiful place, because she had read about it in the original story. Then Kaelus walked along these very same roads with Diana, and together they smiled very happily, enjoying each other's company. And now, all the heroine could do was walk next to the Marquis, since she was afraid to remind him once again about the saint. Suddenly, Kael was the first to break the very long silence that had reigned between him and the girl, as he decided to confess something. Hestia didn't expect that the gentleman himself would suddenly say that he had once walked here with the current princess. She admitted that she knew about it, and Kael whispered sadly that nothing could be hidden from his wife. The girl saw no point in lying to the Marquis about her knowledge, although she felt sad along with him because she wanted the guy to smile. However, Hessie looked straight into Kael's eyes and told him that around her, he didn't have to pretend that everything was okay. Only after these words was the Marquis finally able to calmly immerse himself in his own memories of the princess. When he walked with Diana, the lady was amazed at literally everything she saw around her and showed it to her friend. Miss was even impressed by the glare of the sun on the water, which she always told the Marquis, who smiled at her. The guy shared that the saint was shining so brightly that he didn't even think that he had the right to even accidentally touch her. Only now the gentleman himself did not even understand the reasons for his behavior, because he believed that it was clearly unnecessary. Hestia listened carefully to Kael's words, and at the same time, she felt pain in her own chest because of his sad words. The Marquis suggested that his wife might be uncomfortable with such dialogues, but she shook her head. At this point, the servants noticed that the boy and girl had stopped ahead and decided to wait until they started walking again. And Hestia explained to her husband that in fact, for everyone around her, it was enough to simply live and enjoy a simple life. The heroine herself thought at the same time that believing in one's own rightness is not always the right path. She remembered all of Diana's beliefs very well and hated her for it very much because she absolutely could not understand it. Kael noticed that the girl was seriously thinking for some reason, and therefore he carefully called out to her to bring her to her senses. Since even now the lady continued to remain silent, the guy even began to worry about her, but did not know how he could help. However, after a few minutes, Hestia finally came to her senses as she thought of what she wanted to tell her husband. Tucking a strand of hair behind her ear, the lady with a gentle smile suggested that she too try to live the simplest life. She suddenly stated very confidently that she could completely relieve Kaelus from any complex and very difficult tasks. It was clear from the boy's face that he liked such pleasant words with concern for him, although the Marquis did not say anything in response. As soon as Kaelus opened his mouth, a strong wind suddenly blew upon them, instantly ruffling the heroine's hair. The girl did not expect such a trick from nature, so she did not secure her hair too tightly, and it completely came undone. It was the first time Kael had ever seen a lady in such an unkempt state that he couldn't help but grin, covering his mouth with his hand. However, even this was not enough, because the guy then began to openly laugh at this situation. Hestia couldn't understand why her hair was in such disarray again, since her husband's hair was much longer. Suddenly, the guy gently took the Miss's face with both hands and asked if it wasn't too late for her to tell him something like that. Carefully removing the dangling ribbon from Hessie's head, Kael explained that she had already done more for him than she could ever hope to. So, now adjusting his wife's hair, the Marquis said that he was already very grateful to her for everything that had happened. The heroine was shocked to hear something like this from a usually silent and indifferent gentleman. But what confused the girl even more was that Kaelus suddenly, for some reason, began to slowly approach her face. Hestia's mouth dropped open in surprise, and she didn't even think about the fact that she could push her beloved back at any moment. She blushed terribly, because she realized that if the Marquis came any closer, he would touch her lips. But instead, Kaelus suddenly finished tying the ribbon on his wife's head, which he informed her about, moving away. What surprised Hestia most was that the Marquis had somehow gotten hold of the hairpin she had lost not long ago and secured it to her ponytail. The heroine guessed that she had dropped the decoration during the shaking of the carriage, and Kael had picked it up and had been silently keeping it with him all this time. Now the lady was ashamed that she thought about completely different actions of her beloved, and he just wanted to help her. The guy suddenly noticed that, thanks to the efforts of his wife, the renovated embankment looked very beautiful and pleasant. So he smiled genuinely and said he had no idea how many times he had to say thank you. The girl was so surprised and pleasantly surprised by her beloved's words that she could not say anything in response. Miss once again realized that she did the right thing when she chose her beloved as the goal of her life. Since they had already seen everything they wanted, the guy suggested going home and headed towards the carriage first. And at that moment, the heroine thought that in fact it was she who should have thanked Kaelus for everything. She raised her head and looked around again, realizing how beautiful nature was everywhere. Hestia's mood immediately lifted due to everything that had happened, so she smiled at her thoughts. It so happened that, except for her lover, everything else for the lady was simply like meaningless text. A few days later, Harmonia came to visit the heroine and immediately asked about the Miss's trip with her husband. Hestia even spat out all the tea by accident out of surprise, because she clearly remembered that she had not told Madame about this. In response, the woman explained with a cheerful smile that everyone in high circles does nothing but talk about the couple. Only now did the lady realize how quickly the rumors had spread, although she herself had not expected it. Looking at her teacher, Miss guessed that she was simply curious to know about the romantic plan for the trip. But the girl had to disappoint the aristocrat, as she said that she and Kael had simply inspected the property. When it came to gathering soap makers, Hestia became despondent again, as she still couldn't find anyone. But in fact, the Marquise was not at all sad about this, because the young gentleman quickly coped with this task. The guy himself pretended that doing something like this was extremely simple for him, and did not take much time at all, while the heroine looked at her beloved with wide eyes, and her face was very surprised. For the Marquis, the most important thing was that now many poor people could finally find work. Harmonia was pleasantly surprised when she heard that Kaelus had suddenly taken on the matter personally and was able to help his wife. Immediately after these words, the girl enthusiastically began to tell the teacher how good her lover was. It was indeed very important for Hestia to succeed in this matter, so she was extremely grateful to the Marquis for his help. But what bothered the lady most was that, despite all her noise at Diana's tea party, Madame still continued to communicate with her. At the same time, Harmonia very successfully pretended that absolutely nothing bad had happened to anyone, and this led Hessie to think that the relationship between the aristocrat and the princess had, albeit imperceptibly, changed. In order to observe all the rules of elementary politeness, Miss asked how Madame had lived all this time. As soon as the Marquise asked this question, the teacher suddenly became gloomy, because she had problems. Imagine the girl's surprise when she heard that Madame had come to her because of the situation with the princess. At the same time, it was clear from the woman's face how difficult it was for her to say every word against her former ward. So Hestia gave the aristocrat a reserved support, agreeing that the saint had a straightforward character. However, the lady was forced to admit that she did not expect to hear something like this from Harmonia about Diana. Then the woman finally sadly admitted that Madame Merope had decided to leave the imperial palace. This was great news for the miss, because she knew that the old woman had been the guardian of the ruling family for many years. Harmonia was greatly troubled by the fact that although the emperor and the prince tried to stop the maid of honor, it was useless. As a result, Madame, who loved Merope very much, even suggested that it was all because of the princess. Hestia immediately remembered that the old woman really had nothing to do with the recent tea party. Remembering that event, Madame assumed that it was not for nothing that the Marquise had been so bold there. However, she was still concerned about the condition of the lady-in-waiting, who was so diligently leaving her imperial home. Although the heroine outwardly expressed sympathy, inwardly she rejoiced that Diana had ruined her reputation. Harmonia herself came to the conclusion that it was time for her to talk to the princess so that she would not act so boldly. But instead of coming up with some kind of plan, Madame suddenly admitted that she couldn't find a place for herself. These words greatly surprised the Marquise, because Madame was one of those who believed in her people to the very end. But right now, the woman clearly didn't know whether she should even try to help the woman who was playing around with her saintly status. Hestia couldn't believe that Harmonia herself had ultimately abandoned the saint and was now asking her for a favor. Suddenly, Madame announced that she wanted the Marquise to personally come to the imperial palace and talk to the princess. The heroine did not expect such a turn of events at all, and then froze in place in surprise. The girl could not imagine such a situation at all, while the lady had great faith in her. The aristocrat eventually came so close to her student that the lady even saw her own reflection in his eyes. The lady tried to remind her that the saint did not like her after tea, but Harmonia did not listen to her at all. As a result, the woman became so emotional that it was easier for the lady to silently listen to her words. The girl faced a very difficult choice, since she absolutely did not want to lose the teacher's trust. At the same time, Madame herself understood how many difficulties she had just caused with her not entirely simple request. But she increasingly came to the conclusion that at least someone needed to talk to Diana urgently. The fact is that when Harmonia herself spoke to the saint, she abruptly put her cup of tea on the table out of indignation. After which the princess declared that she was not going to listen about Merope and everything else, and walked out of the room. The woman understood that if the prince's wife continued to behave in this manner, she would quickly lose all authority. That's why she decided to turn to the only person she could trust in this situation. But the heroine herself was not at all delighted that the aristocrat asked her for help, while Harmonia herself, with undying hope in her eyes, continued to look at her faithful student. The girl guessed that Madame had acted very cunningly because she had placed all the initiative and responsibility on her shoulders. But on the other hand, it became clear to Hestia that Diana's condition was so bad that she didn't even listen to the teacher. Rumor had it that the Marquise knew that the Emperor and the Prince had said that they would never allow Merope to leave their palace. But the princess quarreled more and more with her husband because of this decision, which she absolutely did not like. Since Helios had not yet called her to him, Hestia concluded that he did not yet know about the disappearance of the saint's powers. It also meant that the heroine still had one more opportunity to put pressure on Diana, so she smiled. In the end, the lady told Harmony that she could not refuse such a request, and the woman immediately beamed with a smile. And the miss herself decided that she would definitely take advantage of this a little later and ask the teacher for some favor. At that moment, the heir was walking all alone through his beautiful garden of lilies and other flowers. The guy needed to collect his thoughts and get over the fact that Merope had announced to everyone that she was leaving soon. Helios had known this woman since childhood and loved her with all his heart, so he was very upset about the possible separation. The maid of honor was a loyal assistant to the imperial family her entire life, so no one could imagine life without her. As a little boy, Heli lost his mother early, but Merope more than replaced his empress. So, as soon as the guy heard about his assistant leaving, he immediately burst into her room without knocking. Madame was packing her things at the time, so she only nodded briefly when the prince asked if she was really leaving. After which the maid of honor bowed low and announced that all the other servants would take good care of the gentleman. Then the heir could not stand it, and anxiously asked if the woman had made such a decision because of quarrels with the princess. But the lady did not admit this, but only said that she was simply tired of working so honestly for so long. So now, without having stopped Merope, Helios walked alone in the garden, but could not find any solution. Only now did he realize that for Diana, all old-fashioned ladies were simply a hotbed of luxury and authoritarianism. It was for this reason that the girl arranged such a brazen tea party, wanting to declare her beliefs to everyone at once. But Merope immediately perceived such actions as an insult to her dignity, and therefore could not tolerate them. Heli had heard many rumors, so now he was probably sure that it was because of his wife that the lady-in-waiting was leaving the palace. The heir was extremely sad about this, but he could not choose between the two women he loved. Unexpectedly for himself, the guy suddenly noticed that his wife had even stopped taking proper care of the garden. But once upon a time, a girl convinced him that when she sees beautiful flowers, she immediately feels at peace. The princess then said with a smile that the prince looked too anxious, so he should also look at the plants. In response, the guy began to flirt, and approaching his wife, asked what he should do if the flowers suddenly disappeared. And the saint whispered that she would then appear behind him and would definitely console him with her own embrace. Therefore, when Heli suddenly heard a female voice behind him, he immediately decided that it was a saint who had come to him. He turned around abruptly and shouted her name, as he was now in confusion and really needed any support. But instead of his beloved, the heir suddenly saw a puzzled Hestia who came to him for a dialogue. Noticing that Helios was clearly not himself, the Marquise anxiously asked him what had happened. And in the heir's head, the image of the princess, who promised to always be there at the right moment, still flickered. In the end, the guy couldn't stand it and said out loud that he was extremely disappointed to see the Marquise next to him. The girl did not expect such a reaction at all, and even thought that it was in vain that she appeared next to the prince at such a moment. The heir himself thought that the ladies' voices were very different, but for some reason he so easily confused them with each other. It was very difficult for Hestia to stay close to such an arrogant man, but she ordered herself to endure. Although the girl received the request from the madam herself, she still did not intend to talk specifically to the princess. So the lady came to the imperial palace precisely in order to have a proper talk with the heir. The Marquise realized that she had guessed the time of arrival, since the guy's face was extremely worried when he turned around. Hestia was not sure whether the prince was so worried about Madame Merope or about his father's deteriorating health. Unexpectedly, Heli himself interrupted the girl's thoughts and said that he was glad to meet her because he just wanted to talk to her about something. The prince looked so thoughtful and worried that it became clear that it was difficult for him to speak. For a moment, Hestia even thought that Diana had already told her husband about the disappearance of her abilities. But instead, the guy asked if Kael had finally inspected his possessions, which surprised the heroine. From shock, she even mentally fell face down, although for the heir himself, nothing changed. A few seconds later, the lady explained that they had indeed gone on a short trip together. Heli asked what the Marquis' health was like, and the miss explained that she had taken the best doctor with her, just in case. This made the prince understand that Kaelus still could not come to his senses and was ill due to mental problems. Looking at Helios, the Marquise realized that he became interested in his friend's condition only when he himself became ill. Nevertheless, Hestia was already glad that she was able to understand that the saint had not yet told her husband about her prediction. The girl was very interested in how long Diana would hide this terrible secret from everyone. But revealing all this was not in the heroine's plans for now, so she thanked the prince with a smile for his concern. The lady noticed that Helios looked different than usual today, and he immediately began to be rude to her in response. Suddenly, in conversation, Hestia specifically mentioned the emperor, which the guy could not leave unnoticed. So he anxiously asked what the lady meant, and she explained that she knew that her prediction had come true. After which the miss added that although the princess had used her power on the ruler, his son still looked anxious. Hestia reminded the prince that she would learn all the important secrets anyway, and he understood that the marquise was telling the truth. Then he admitted that the emperor had difficulty moving, and Hestia said that she knew he was not fully healed. Hearing this, Helios immediately became angry at the girl who had seen a lot, but said little about it. Covering her grin with her hand, the heroine asked in a sarcastic voice if his wife hadn't told the heir anything yet. But Heli absolutely did not understand what Diana had to do with it, and in response, the marquise stated that she would not say anything for now. This angered the prince even more, but he was in no condition to run after the girl and demand an explanation from her. Moreover, before leaving, Hestia said that the guy would sooner or later find out everything himself, and he thought about it. The heroine decided to take maximum advantage of the prince's condition and reminded him of Merope, which struck the heir even more. The girl spoke in riddles because she wanted Helios to come to his own conclusions about what was happening around him. Finally, she said with a smile that now she doesn't even know who the most authoritative person in the imperial palace is. These words deeply hurt the crown prince, and he asked the lady to leave such a difficult topic for him for now. Noticing that she had gone a little too far, the heroine immediately asked for forgiveness just in case, because she did not want to provoke anger. Walking through the garden, Hestia thought about how many more secrets were hidden within the walls of the imperial palace. And every such misunderstanding was only to the girl's advantage, so she grinned slyly while no one was looking. The marquise had no doubt that Helios was smart and would be able to understand what she was hinting at. The guy really guessed that, although the marquise scolded Diana again. This time she had some reason for it. He had enough time to communicate with the lady to understand that she would not throw around such words without reason. Therefore, the prince decided to quickly visit his wife, who at that moment was drinking tea in the room as if nothing had happened. When she saw her beloved, the girl smiled at him radiantly as always, because she was sincerely glad that he had come. But Helios himself could not smile as brightly at that moment, because he knew that the miss was hiding something from him. Not noticing the heir's condition, the princess invited him to have a cup of tea with her, as they often did together. But the guy stopped her and said that he had come with a very important request, although he was too unsure of its necessity. The saint wanted to joke, when suddenly the prince asked her to heal her father again, which caused the girl to even let go of the teapot. Ever since Hestia had predicted her loss of powers, Diana had been constantly afraid that she would one day hear those words. However, she managed to force herself to smile again and asked what her lover was talking about. The boy breathed a sigh of relief when the princess said that she would definitely visit the emperor again tomorrow afternoon. But then the prince asked if Diana hadn't started using her power too often, which frightened her again. Then the girl could not stand it any longer and said that if she lost her strength, then she would be able to understand her husband's concerns. After which the lady lied and said that she was completely fine, so he should not doubt her abilities. The heir immediately tried to object, but the miss interrupted his words and firmly took his hand to finally calm him down. The princess explained that she would keep an eye on the ruler, so Helios would have absolutely no need to worry about anything. The girl tried to smile as kindly as possible and asked if her husband could trust her in such a situation. No matter how sad the heir was, the support from his beloved worked very well, so he thought about it. However, Heli still wanted to ask the holy question when suddenly someone knocked on the door of the room where they were sitting together. The princess immediately allowed entry, and a maid appeared in the room, who conveyed that the priests were already waiting. But Diana said that they didn't need to wait at all, since she was already on her way, and so she got up from the sofa. Heli protested, but the lady explained that this meeting had been planned in advance, so it was time for her to go. As a result, the guy was once again left completely alone, although he didn't want that more than anything in the world right now. As they walked down the corridor, the maid noticed that for some reason, the mistress was in a much greater hurry than usual. The assistant even thought that someone was following the princess, although everything in the palace was in perfect order. The whole point was that the saint was worried about her husband's question, which completely by chance hit the mark. The girl didn't know for sure whether Hestia had managed to tell the prince anything, and because of this, she nervously bit her fingers. She suddenly remembered the advice of the Marquise, who suggested a way for the princess to hide her secret as long as possible. This made Diana understand that at the moment, Kaelus's wife was unlikely to act, so everything was fine. So the saint decided that it was not yet time to confess anything to her husband, because her powers had not yet completely disappeared. The princess hoped until the very end that Hestia's prediction might accidentally not come true, and that this would save her. She knew that if her powers really did disappear, it would immediately become known. But until then, she was going to keep quiet. At this moment, Helios was still sitting all alone in the room and thinking about what was happening in his life. For some reason, everyone he trusted to the end decided to turn away from the heir at the most difficult moment. Moreover, what tormented the guy most was the fact that his beloved for some reason became very suspicious, but did not say anything. The heir could not understand at all where exactly he had made the mistake for which he was now forced to suffer. For a moment, Heli even suggested that the Marquise might be to blame for everything, but he immediately threw this thought out of his head. He admitted to himself that he himself could not complete any task, and no one but he was to blame for this. Unexpectedly for himself, the prince realized that he had experienced such difficult periods in his life before, but it was easier for him. It was all because at those moments the faithful Marquis Kaelus always remained by his side, so he decided